We're live, we're rolling. Good morning, everyone. No, good afternoon, everyone. It's noon. My name is Jeff Mann. I'm from Tenable Network Security. I want to thank Circle CityCon for letting me speak here today. Let me start with the agenda. First off, I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about me, not because I care what you think about me, but it does give some context for why I'm talking about this subject matter. Then we'll go through about why I'm talking about this. Some questions that I've been asking myself about pen testing. I'm going to infuse a little bit of where I'm coming from. Again, that relates to where I've been and the experiences I've had. And we have such a huge audience. Feel free to make this an interactive discussion. If you want to argue, disagree, strongly object, feel free to jump in anytime. Let's get the ball rolling a little bit. This was a debate that was online a couple months ago when Black Hat was coming out. There was this debate of what's the greatest hacker movie ever made. So, does anybody think Black Hat was the greatest hacker movie ever made? War Games? Sneakers. That's Sneakers? Is that because Rogue said Sneakers was the greatest hacker movie? Rogue, that guy that did the keynote, Rouge, Space Rogue. Firewall, Hackers, anybody, any movies that aren't listed there? There might be more. Algorithm. I think that in terms of what your favorite movie is, it's a little bit how old you are and how long you've been in the business. I'm still kind of partial to War Games. War Games in its day was the most accurate hacking movie out there. It was kind of realistic. Followed strongly and shortly thereafter by Sneakers. Hackers, I didn't think was that good. I haven't seen Black Hat yet, so I don't know. Enemy of the State I have up there just because of where I used to work. So this is me. Work for Tenable. There's my contact information. That's me about 23 years ago, 24, 25 years ago. So I used to be cool. I started out in the DoD. I was there for 13 years. Got out of the DoD kind of at the start of this whole internet thing. Everything was exploding about 20 years ago. So I've been out in the commercial world for about 20 years, and I was in PCI purgatory for the last 10 or so. I used to work at no such agency. We can talk about Snowden maybe after the talk if you want. I did a couple different things at NSA. I started out on the defensive side of the house, what we called back then InfoSec. And I was actually working for an organization that produced paper crypto systems, one-time pads, the most secure crypto system in the world. It's unbreakable if you do it right. Implementation is the key. I spent a little bit of time then on the ops side of the house. I was there during Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Does anybody remember there was a war 10 years before the war? Everybody was alive at that point? Hopefully. That was kind of cool because the first several years that I was at NSA, it was the Cold War. The enemy was the Great Satan, the Soviet Union. And there was a lot of stuff going on, but there was also a lot of planning for, when there was, real battles going on. So Desert Shield, Desert Storm actually happening was kind of an interesting experience. I went back over to the InfoSec side and started working for an organization that was called Fielded Systems Evaluations. And what that was somebody at NSA, pretty smart person, figured out, we design the most secure crypto systems in the world. And back in those days, NSA was it. They were the ones that produced crypto for the entire DoD, for the entire government community. It was there was no competition. It was a one-stop shop. We made little black boxes where plain text went in, something happened, and code came out. And then the black box was on the other end. The reverse happened. Everything was fine. But somebody figured out, the way that we often break and compromise crypto systems and the communications and the message traffic of our adversary is we take advantage of the fact that people don't use it well. Like a one-time pad is the most secure system in the world. It can't be broken because it's a one-time use key. But there's some places that might use that page, that pad of key, maybe one page per month just to save a little money or whatever the reason was. If you use it more than once, you're compromising the security of that system. It becomes breakable. The devices, the equipment that we produced, people would figure out ways around it. And back in those days, it was mostly radios with little boxes attached to it. And the radio operators out in the field, they might be 18, 19-year-old guys. They'd figure out shortcuts and ways around following the rules that produced the secure communication. So somebody decided, if everybody else is doing that, how do we know that all of our troops and all of our people are using our perfectly designed, pristine systems the most secure way, the way that they are intended? So field systems evaluation. When I started there was a branch of that office that was called networked systems, and that's about the time that the internet from the browser perspective came about. Mozilla came out, and everybody started getting on the internet and doing things with web browsers. And so we started teaching ourselves how to hack and hack networks, and that quickly spilled into pen testing, vulnerability assessment, a little bit of threat detection and forensics. And the office that I was in, because this was becoming so quickly popular, they reorganized within the NSA, and we became part of this thing called the Systems Network and Attack Center, SNAC. So we were pioneers, sort of. I'm really glad that Wired finally published this because I sat on this for so many years. There's a statue in the center of CIA. Has anybody ever heard of this thing, the crypto statue? And Wired, I think earlier in 2013, this is from July, they published an article about this guy at CIA had broken the thing. He'd done it at lunchtime. It had taken him years to do it, and he'd finally cracked most of the code that was in this statue. And I was always like, that's not the complete story. So it's kind of interesting. You can go out and find this article online, and I'm surprised at how accurate it is. Let's just say that in a day and age where media gets the message and the story wrong so many times, there's a lot of truth in this article. But anyway, there's a part of it that says in 1991, a group of NSA cryptanalysis interns, I was one of those interns, was down there. We were kind of offended that this thing was sitting in CIA headquarters because NSA is the crypto organization. So we took it upon ourselves, and we were like finding scraps of paper, and we were scrambling, you get the first part, because you can't really see it, but it's like 4 different sections. So we each took a section, and we each wrote it down. We had a couple people do it twice so we could get the redundancy, make sure we hadn't made any errors. And I still have a printout of the code that we printed out, that we captured. If you read the article, it talks about how there was a memo that went around internally. That's true. That said, we can't do this on company time. We can't use company resources, i.e. the supercomputers that we had. But it became kind of a hobby of the cryptanalytic community with NSA to break the thing. So that was kind of fun. That was finally out in public. So I went out into the commercial world, 1996, because to try to do penetration testing, vulnerability assessment, that type of thing for the government, the DoD, when we first started doing it, and this speaks a little bit to the Snowden thing, sort of. We initially, if we wanted to try to attack something, maybe another organization within NSA, or we were getting asked by different government agencies if we could help them out by testing the security of their networks. One of the early decisions made by the general counsel, who was in charge of making sure that we were doing things legally, because NSA really does take that seriously, They determined that issuing a ping command was considered an act of attack, and therefore would have to go through this chain of command, all these different levels of management, signing off, agreeing, and giving permission. A process that would take sometimes 3 or 4 weeks, because it was paper, it had a little signature block, it had to sit on some secretary's desk who would get it to the manager, who'd get around to it, and then it'd go on to the next person and the next person. All this to issue a ping command. Went out in the private sector, got hired by companies that wanted you to break in, test the security of their systems. You'd have a contract, you'd have a statement of work, you have this amount of time, you have this amount of budget, do your project, give us a report, tell us what's wrong, thank you very much, you're done. Whole lot more fun. Did I mention I do PCI? Well, so I worked for a startup company for about 5 or 6 years, 7 or 8 years. I ended up working for this company called TrustWave. I went to work for them in 2004, and the original TrustWave was started by a bunch of NSA guys. It was actually founded in Maryland. Their office was in Annapolis. These were guys that I knew. It was a small community, and I finally went to work for them right around the time that the PCI data security standard was published. So I started working there. They handed me this document. Here, this is brand new. Figure it out. We're going to do this stuff. So I was there for a couple years. I went on to a couple different companies, and before I knew it, I'd been doing PCI stuff for about 10 years, up until the time when Tenable approached me and said, hey, we want you to come on board as a PCI subject matter expert. We want you to help us figure out how to, use our tools and products to that market, that part of the business. So I've been doing that for about a little bit less than 2 years now. So go ahead, say something about PCI. Parker, you have an opinion? Laugh, cat calls. Okay. I'm just giving everybody a moment if they want to say something. But to counter all those things that you didn't say that you wanted to say, these are some of my customers. Actually, these are the majority of my customers in my 10 years of being a QSA for the PCI community. Some of you work for some of these companies. Some of these companies you probably haven't heard of. A lot of these companies, if you recognize the names, they probably do employ people like you. They have a security staff, they have an IT staff, they have governance, risk, and compliance, they have internal auditors. They're all organized under a CIO or a CISO. But a lot of these companies, you start looking up there, there's grocery stores, there's clothing stores, women's clothing stores, retailers, merchants, a flower shop, popcorn, cookies, chocolates. Not all these companies have the infrastructure that we're used to dealing with. Not all these companies have the same kind of budget, the same kind of interest, the same kind of intestinal fortitude for doing technology, yet alone security. So I say this, don't dismiss PCI, don't dismiss most QSAs, or at least not this one, because I had to go into all those different companies, and sometimes they knew security, and so they thought I was just a stupid auditor, so I had to kind of prove, no, I know a little bit about what we're talking about. But a lot of times these were companies that didn't have a lot of expertise. They didn't really understand the security standard, this PCI thing. So I became a teacher. I was explaining things to them. Well, this is what it means. This is where you need to look to apply this certain requirement. Which all gets us to the pen test. I came to work for Tenable. I got out of PCI purgatory, and I started being allowed to go to things like security conferences again, which I hadn't been to in probably 10 or 12 years. I think the first one I went to pretty much was DerbyCon last fall, and the keynote address was this guy named Ed Scotus. Probably most of you know who he is, giving this talk about how to deliver the world's best pen test. And that was kind of cool. Give the best pen test of your life. And what he said, essentially, his key points, you can read those. I don't need to read them to you. But what he was essentially saying is pen tests need to be meaningful. They need to be, find cool stuff, be educational. You need to be able to report back to your customer, something. It's, if you're a pen tester, you don't feel like you've done your job unless you've broken into something or you've gotten some kind of good results. And how many of you are pen testers? One? Pen tester wannabes? Okay, that's fine. Pen testers for commercial, you do it for other customers that hire you, or you're doing it for the company that you work for. It's a difference. As I was sitting there listening to this talk coming out of PCI for 10 years, where I hadn't done pen tests in a long time, but I've had to review pen test reports because that's one of the requirements for PCI is you do an annual pen test. And I've done a lot of consulting, and I've done a lot of talking to customers that don't understand often the security principles and the foundations, things that I hear echoed through talk after talk and after talk at these security conferences. But as the keynote was being given, the question that kept sticking in my head is, what's a pen test? Now, there was an assumption that he knew, that the audience knew, that there was an agreement on what it was, so let's move beyond that and talk about it. But that kind of stuck with me because I thought, if you don't define what a pen test is, how do you know if you've done a good one? How do you know if it's been good or bad? If you don't start with some sort of foundational, what's the goal? What are you trying to accomplish? And in my experience, and I did pen testing for a lot of years, but pen testing then, and I think pen testing often now, is very often what I would call a vulnerability assessment. If the goal is to find vulnerabilities, I say that's a vulnerability assessment, not a pen test. When I used to do pen tests, I used to be sort of on the management things, and so I'd be selling these jobs, and a customer would come to us and say, we want a pen test. And I would say, why? What do you want to accomplish? Well, we want to find all the vulnerabilities. And then I would say, okay, well, that's not a pen test. That's a vulnerability assessment. And they say, well, what's the difference? And then I would have to explain it to them. So what is a pen test? And I'm dating myself. I know it's changed a little bit these days in terms of what the goals are. But back in the day, the goal was really to get a root shell. You were trying to, from the outside of a network, break into that network, establish some kind of a toehold, get some kind of access to some system, whatever. And once that was established, then you would try to elevate privileges, get root, and then for the guys that I worked with mostly, we considered that done. Root a box, move on, try to root another box, move on, try to root another box. And I used to have disagreements with the guys that I worked with because they were really good at rooting boxes. I was never really that good. But they would root the box and move on. I'd sit on the box and start looking around, seeing what's on this box. What is this? Is it a workstation? Is it a server? And back when I was doing this, it was mostly Unix workstations, then a little bit of Windows NT. But I'd start looking around at, well, whose box is this? If it's a desktop, oh, it's an admin. Oh, it's somebody in finance. Is there juicy information here? How well is that information protected? I rooted a mainframe one time. How many people, well, not many of you are pen testers, but if you've ever, thought about it, mainframes are kind of hard to break into, mostly because nobody knows how they work. Nobody knows the operating system. But I've rooted one. I'll tell you how I rooted it. I was at a client. We rooted a box. It was an admin. He had a mailbox. I looked through his mailbox and I found this file, this email that said system passwords. I opened it up. And there was this long list of admin passwords, one of which was for their mainframe. So I opened up their emulator, which happened to be running on his box, typed it in, I was in. So I can claim that I've rooted a mainframe. I had no idea what to do once I was on it. Had zero idea of any of the commands, but I was there. Sometimes the goal of a pen test is to, can you get to here? The capture the flag exercise. Sometimes that was get to a system, maybe a database. Sometimes it's, can you find a specific piece of information? Back in the early days when we were still at the DoD, what was considered the senior level management, the deputy director, he put a file on his desktop and said, tell me if you can read it. And then we added to the file the response to whether we could read it or not. A lot of times the goals of the pen test, because they're not clearly defined, it's kind of loosey-goosey. And I think realistically, a lot of times the goal of the pen test is it's vulnerability discovery. What are all my holes? But also, and I've heard this a lot discussed in the talks around here, is it's a way to try to prove that something needs to be done. You've got these huge holes. We need to fix them. You need security. You need to invest in technology and people. I need to go to that training course. And that can all be legitimate. I think it's pretty well understood and believed that a successful pen test is you have to have pwnage. I'm trying to use modern language. We used to call it rooting the box. Now it's pwnage. Sometimes it's getting to certain types of information. And, in my time as a QSA with the PCI, obviously it was getting the credit card information, finding it, seeing it. That was the goal. Can you get to the credit card information, or can you not get to it? In the early days of pen testing, when I was doing it, heck, we were trying to convince people why they needed to have firewalls if they were going to be connecting to the internet. And then it was, well, you also need an intrusion detection system. And then it was also you need access control, and on and on and on and on. And as people started putting the firewalls out and they got kind of decent, and people started putting the intrusion detection out and started doing the things, what worked one time didn't necessarily work the next time. And I think industry-wide, and again, there's a gap. I was away from it for a while, and now I'm back into it. But in a lot of ways, it seems like, if you want to win as a pen tester, so if you can't just hack over the internet from the outside, you have to start talking about, well, what about phishing attacks? What about social engineering? What about breaking in physically? What about this? What about that? And to me, it's a lot of like, and I'm a Star Trek, not a Star Wars person, but to me, it's a lot like the Kobayashi Maru. Everybody familiar with the Kobayashi Maru? Or do I need to explain? Anybody not familiar with it? Okay. So in Star Trek II, the movie Wrath of Khan, they talk about how Captain Kirk, when he was at the Starfleet Academy, was the only one to complete the Kobayashi Maru. This was a test for all Academy students, and it was basically supposed to be designed to see how you'd react in an unwinnable situation. So there's like they're role-playing a scenario where the ship is doomed and they're all going to die. And Captain Kirk, it says early on in the movie, he's the only one that ever beat it. He's the only one that ever won it. And so at the climax of the movie, and I don't want to be a spoiler, somebody asks him finally, how did you beat the thing? And he said, oh, well, I broke in and rewrote the code, changed the rules, changed the scenario. And they said, well, that's cheating. He said, it worked. So the Kobayashi Maru, change the rules, change the ground rules until you can win. I think there's a lot of that in pen testing these days. Which is not to say it's necessarily bad, but it doesn't necessarily meet the goals or the objectives, especially if you haven't defined them. So, what does this lead into? Again, I got to go back to PCI. If you're not familiar with PCI, PCI is a set of 12 major requirements that are divided up into 6 security goals. And we can get into philosophical discussions, but I would argue that those 6 goals are pretty much standard for anything. If you want to do the basics of security, you need to be doing all these things. Anybody strongly disagree? Build a secure network, harden the systems, the servers, the systems, the workstations, these days the devices that you drop in, make sure that they're hardened, securely configured, default settings are changed. So you protect the infrastructure that you're building, and then you protect the data. In this case, it's a specific type of data, whether it's at rest or in motion. Protect it. Protect yourself against viruses and malware. Keep the applications up to date. Keep the systems up to date. do all that, monitor everything, log everything, test everything regularly, and oh, by the way, have all your processes that you're doing all this written down in procedures and follow them. Rinse, lather, repeat. Lather, rinse, repeat. There's an implied order to that in my thinking. And if you've done all that, when it comes time to do the pen testing, and this is new in version 3. Version 3 was published at the end of 2013, so this was lauded as something completely new for PCI in terms of the standards. In a lot of ways it was, because they actually tried to define what the expectation was for pen testing for PCI customers. And again, I'm not going to read it to you, but basically they're saying inside out, focus on the data. If you've been doing network segmentation to isolate your critical, production systems, that's what you should be pen testing, and you should do it from different vantage points. And they go on, and there's some key elements here. They go on and say that you should be simulating a real-world attack scenario. They say things like penetration testing is an active process. Near and dear to my heart, because of my history of a pen tester, it should be manual. Pen testing is not something that's done just by running a scanner or running a tool. There really needs to be a person that's sitting down and making sense of the preliminary results that you're getting, the recon that you've done, and sort of connecting the dots and saying, what can I do with this? And how can I exploit? How can I take advantage of what I'm seeing? That, to me, is a key element of a pen test. Unfortunately, PCI, in their usual wisdom, they don't require that as an absolute. They use that word, and I can't find where it is right now. But they use the word should. And for all the companies that I worked with, when they're reading through the standard, what do we have to do to meet this? If they got to the word should, they say, oh, good, I don't have to do that, whether it's a best practice or not. If it says must, then they know they have to do it. Should, they'd argue till the cows came home that they didn't have to do it. So my question was and is, if you've built secure systems, you've built a secure network, you've got everything up and running, and I know that this is very purist in thought, that this doesn't exist a lot in the real world. But if you're doing all these things, then what's left? Why pen test? Let me go back. I'm going the wrong way. Let me go back to this. Let me ask you guys, if you're doing all this already, what do you think is the goal of a pen test? Or what do you think is the outcome of a pen test? Yep, find something that you miss. Like a safety net. Sure. Any other ideas? About something, well, basically something falling through the cracks. That never happens. Servers never drop into networks, or devices never pop into your networks that you don't know about. People make mistakes. If you're relying on patch deployment, you have a patch management program. What if a system is offline when the patch gets pushed out? Laptops, devices, they're there, they're not there. Things happen. I mean, this is not a perfect world. So, why pen test? Obviously, a lot of companies that I dealt with considered it a checkbox requirement. A lot of the companies through the years have really treated it as a vulnerability assessment. We started getting into many years ago, and I know it happens these days, you start testing your defense mechanisms. You've got IDS in place. You want to see if it's working. Or if you've outsourced it to a managed service provider, you want to test and see how well they're doing it since you're paying for it. And at some level, you can use the pen test as an exercise, and look what we did. That's indication, and let us educate you on how you should be doing things differently in your network. What I've been thinking, and this is open for debate, that if a pen test is going to be performed, and you're doing all these things anyway to have a security program, And I would argue that if I'm saying that a pen test is not a vulnerability assessment, what is it? I would say it should be more threat-based. And that sort of goes back to the language that the PCI used in imitating real-world attack scenarios. To my way of thinking, it's kind of like a live fire test. It's a fire drill. You've got all this stuff in place. You're doing it. You want to see how well it's working, or you want to see what's, have you missed something? Have you overlooked something? So in some ways, it should be a safety net, and in some ways, it's just how well you're doing. But it's attacking from the perspective of what's your defenses. Which leads me to believe that my ideal pen test is you define it first and foremost, especially if you're doing it for a customer. You've been hired as a pen tester. Set the goals, set the expectations, have a solid testing methodology, and I think pen testing methodologies are pretty well understood and pretty there's some differences, but you have to scan your environment, and I use the term scan loosely, figure out what you're dealing with, figure out what's likely to be an attack vector, and execute, try to break in, and do things as real world and as timely as possible. There's been a lot of malware in the news in the retail merchant PCI environment the last couple of years. So a lot of those types of customers are very concerned about, do we have the ability to detect the malware so that we're not the next people on Krebs. But to my way of thinking, pen testing, the ideal pen testing, and I'm speaking as a role of a consultant, an advisor to a customer, to a third party. If I've done my job right and I've educated them and I've helped them to put a security program in place, when the pen testing happens, ultimately, it should have no results. It should fail. You've tried this. You tried the back door. It was locked. You tried the side door. It was locked. You put a ladder and went up to the second story window. It too was locked. Oh, and the alarms went off and the police showed up. I tried to use analogies often when I was with our customers to just try to help them understand the security concepts, because they don't understand security concepts for the most part. Put it in language they understand. Make it analogies, make references to things that kind of make sense to them. So, I'm realizing I've never been looking at the camera through this whole thing. It's all right, I'm ugly. So this is where, the thoughts that I had from hearing this presentation and sort of the message that I wanted to get out to you guys and the community is to try to start thinking about pen testing in a different way. Try to shift from vulnerabilities to threats. There's a place for vulnerability discovery, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I think that, and I hear this time and time again, vulnerability testing, pen testing is like it's like the segue, it's the way in, it's the beginning of the conversation. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've even heard this weekend, and you've all heard them. Oh, I was doing this and doing that, and there was no password set, or it was still the default password, so I popped it, I was right in. That to me is not very productive, because whoever you're targeting, the customer presumably, you shouldn't be testing to see whether they've changed the default password. Somehow there needs to be a more cost-effective way of making them understand you need to change all the default passwords. Then hire me to try to break in. When that's already been done, let's move on to something else. So I think I had this on another slide, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. But if you're doing a pen test and you find something like a default password, your finding is not, when you're writing up the report, I found a default password. Your finding is you've got some sort of process issue that's putting systems out there with default passwords. Do you get the difference? Do you see the difference? If you find a box that's missing patches, no, not really. That's the difference between, do you want to hire a pen tester to find your vulnerabilities, or do you want to follow a security process that eliminates the vulnerabilities that should be eliminated so that the pen tester can find the deeper ones that are not necessarily that apparent. I mean, it's more of a, you should eliminate all the best practice stuff. You shouldn't be finding misconfigurations. You shouldn't be finding default settings. You shouldn't have to hire a pen tester to make that discovery. That should all be done already. Again, I'm a little bit optimistic here. I know real world is you find that stuff all the time. Right. Exactly. I mean, I'll give you many years ago, we were hired by, it was a bank to do a penetration test of their firewall. They'd implemented a firewall as their protection. And we were given a single IP address, and that's the pen test. And if you know anything about pen testing, if you're going up against a single IP address and trying to break through a firewall that's been reasonably set, there isn't a whole lot to do. But in doing what we did, we noticed that within their IP block, within their public-facing range, there were some web servers out there. And we did a little bit of cursory looking because it was beyond the scope of the engagement. And we saw enough to realize these look like they're boxes that have been just right out of the box turned on, default settings. We didn't pop them, but when we reported our results, we said, you know, we did this pen test right here. Firewall looks good, but when we were doing our discovery, we saw a few things over here that we just feel obligated to tell you about. It was beyond the scope, but it sure looks like it could get you in. And I think we were talking to the CIO, and we were in a boardroom, and he was at the table, and all the managers were at the table, and a bunch of the admins were, and the people who were being tested by us were sitting around the perimeter. And the CIO immediately said, "Wow, what's wrong with our processes that is allowing people to put these unsecured web servers out internet reachable that's causing these gaping holes?" And there was this cry of jubilation from the room. You could see the people's eyes lighting up like, yes, that was it. That didn't always happen, but that guy understood. It was a process problem, not oh, we have these web servers, let's quick run around and patch them and change this default settings and we're done. I mean, that's tactical. It needs to be done. But the strategic is there's something going on here that's not right because that should never happen. Does that make sense? So that's all vulnerability based. Now, go for it. I like interaction. Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking of it. I mean, I happen to work for a company that kind of specializes in vulnerabilities, so I might say if you used our stuff, all that stuff shouldn't happen anyway. You can move on, but I'm not saying that because that would be inappropriate. This is just personal, but the pen test shouldn't be the smoking gun to get people to act, to get companies to do something differently. And I think a lot of us in a lot of different ways are struggling with how do we elevate the science, the game, the art of security. So I want to make this educational and give you guys something to think about as you go back to your jobs, especially if you're pen testers. I'm not saying that hacking is bad and inappropriate. Keep doing what you're doing. It's a vital thing that we do in this community. But again, if you're finding a vulnerability, a default password, especially if you're doing this commercially, stop. We did another job one time many years ago when having firewalls was kind of a new thing. A company hired us. They had gone out and bought a gauntlet firewall. Does anybody know what a gauntlet firewall is? Ever heard of that? It was one of the first commercial firewalls. It was the best. Marcus Raynham, the more or less inventor of the firewall, it was the product that was developed from the work that he did. So it was the gold standard in the day firewall. They'd gone through training. They were all proud of themselves. We're ready. They hired us to do a pen test. And our methodology was we'd always start from the outside and try to break in, but then we also told them, let's go move inside because you don't want to rely on the firewall as your single point of failure. And again, this was more of a vulnerability assessment. We would move inside and survey their network and try to run roughshod off their internal network and find vulnerabilities. I mean, we were essentially doing vulnerability assessment. But when we were first starting to do the engagement, when we were on the outside trying to break in, by the way, this was over a 14.4 modem back in the day. So you guys do it a whole lot differently these days. We got right in. It was like there wasn't even a firewall there. We were seeing everything. We were doing port scans. We were doing all sorts of stuff. But we went inside, and while we were inside, they started suffering a denial of service attack. And of course, we were blamed for it because we were the security people there doing something. So we said, well, let's take a time out. We'll stop doing what we're doing, and we'll try to help you out and see what's going on. Because, the guys that I had on my team were network guys. And we said, well, let's take a look at your firewall rules. Let's start there. And back in those days, the firewall rules list was maybe 25 rules. But the last one was any, allow. So we said, stop. We don't need to pen test you anymore because there's something wrong here with the process. So we took what was remaining in the budget and shifted it over to an educational exercise, what we would call security architecture. We kind of helped them, let's look at your network, your topology. What are you trying to accomplish? Should we create some zones? Where's your production, your sensitive data? Let's isolate some things. Back in those days, it was creating different zones off the firewall. And, so we just kind of helped them clean things up and get to a point of secure posture. And when we reported our findings, again, I think in this case it was to a CFO, he said something to the effect of, wow, this is the most intelligent consulting engagement I've ever seen, because you actually didn't just follow the rules of the contract, the statement of work. You stopped and you actually helped us, and you were cost effective. Our money was well spent, and they ended up being our customer for about 5 years. We built a trust relationship, and we became partnered with them in how do we secure your environment. There needs to be more of that. Math slide. I'm coming from the perspective, first and foremost, as a consultant, someone that talked to a lot of different companies. And so teaching about security is really, at some point you have to talk about teaching about risk. If you're talking to a grocery store, they're not going to have the same posture, the same attitude, the same resources to be as secure as, let's say, a credit card company or a financial services company or an insurance company. It's just different. Their risk tolerance is going to be different. But you have to help them understand that. So you need to define terminologies, and you need to break it down into simple language that they can understand. So I use simple math. I've seen 1,000 risk equations of how you determine risk. But at the end of the day, and there is no right or wrong answer for what the risk is, but you have some knowledge of vulnerabilities in your environment. You have somebody that wants to come after you. That is the threat. You factor in what you're doing to protect yourself. And once you've done all that, you also have to factor in how much you want to spend, what's the value of what it is you're trying to protect. And believe me, a lot of companies, they understand, well, we need to do security. But when you try to have a conversation with them about, well, what are you trying to protect? They can't always articulate that. I mean, there's the usual, well, we have, these days it's all PII. We have to protect our customers' data, or our employees' data, or we have to protect the credit card data, or we have to protect the whatever, fill in the blank. They sometimes get all that, but they don't understand where that data is in their network. But very often, if you talk to the C-level people, they just say, well, we just don't want to be hacked. We don't want to be in the news. We don't want our company in the headlines. Fair enough. How much do you want to spend to prevent that from happening? And there is a law of diminishing returns, more math. How much you do and how much you invest in security, and what kind of payoff you get. And, we all know you can do 99% of right, but that 1% you do wrong gets you totally pwned. And there's very few companies that do 99%. 80%, I think, would be a good idea. So there's a lot of variation in this equation, and there's no absolute values to a lot of this. But you can start to plug it in, and there we have the math slide. I've heard a lot of people talking over the last year about things need to change. We're doing things over and over again. I think Space Rogue in his keynote, he said the thing about which I've said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and again and expecting a different result. I think this community is unique because we kind of do know what's going on. We understand the technology, we understand what's at risk, but I think, and feel free to throw stones at me, I think where we fail, and I think part of this is understanding that we have a role in this, but I think where we fail is we don't often articulate very well to the others in the equation, the business owners, the IT people, the various groups and companies, what their role is. We don't articulate very well why things need to be done differently, why there needs to be an investment in security, and so on and so forth. And there's certainly, because of all the breaches that have been in the news, there's probably a new one today, I haven't checked the news, but over the last couple years, months, weeks, what's the latest one is OPM. There's a lot of companies, and I think they're asking a fair question. We've spent millions on security. Why are we still getting hacked? Why is this still happening? Why even bother spending the money? It's happening in the PCI world. They're like, why should we spend money on this when we're getting breached anyway? Why don't we just buy some cyber insurance? Ooh, I said cyber. And be done with it. So these are the types of things that I've done as a consultant. And I've done them reasonably well. I've got customers that I still talk to and I still keep in touch with. They're not paying me, but we formed relationships over the years. And when this malware stuff was coming out late 2013, 2014, they were calling me and they were emailing me saying, is this going to happen to us? And so far, knock on wood, none of my old customers have been in the news. Doesn't mean they won't be tomorrow, and it doesn't mean they're perfectly secure, but it does mean they're doing the process things right. They're being appropriately paranoid. So we as a community, I think, and this is where I think I'm going to come up with a training course. We need to learn how to communicate better with people that don't fundamentally understand what we're talking about or don't speak our language. We're very comfortable talking amongst ourselves, and we get it. And we, all the little side con discussions everywhere, we laugh about all those silly other people out there that don't get it. And I do it too. But we need to learn how to speak to them and get through to them. I've said for years that I'm bilingual. I can talk to you guys, and I haven't touched technology in 10 years. But I'm also as comfortable sitting down with the managers, the C-level people, and having a conversation with them and getting them to a point of understanding. That takes practice. Not all of us can do that. I mean, there's a lot of really sharp people in this community that are really, really uncomfortable putting them in front of a crowd of people or even in a small group of people and having interpersonal communication. We need to educate and teach people how to do that because they're really smart and they need to be able to share that information with others. What I always used to do, and I hope this doesn't come across as sexist, but my wife is not a technical person, but I would always try to sit down at the dinner table and run things past her. And if I could get her to understand it, then I knew I was coming up with the right language, and I knew I was saying things in a way that non-technical people could understand it. So she was kind of like a sounding board. So find yourself a sounding board. Not somebody that knows your language and is your peer and understands what you're talking about, but find somebody that's not technical, that doesn't get all this stuff, and try to start having a conversation with them and try to learn a way to communicate the concepts to them in a way that's like, oh, You mean it's like this? Yes, it's like that. It's an art, just like a lot of what we do is an art. Understand the business. One of the best forms of communications is learning how to be a listener. Things like, if you're trying to explain a concept, ask the person that you're talking to, what did you hear me say? What have you taken away with what I'm trying to communicate to you? If what they say back to you isn't in line with what you were saying, rewind and try it again. These are just interpersonal communication skills, but they're important. I had this thought just yesterday or the day before. Everything's about gaming. There's a lot of gamers in this community. And in a lot of ways, security is a game. But, I come from an analytical background, and I kind of like to think of security as a puzzle. And not just from the perspective of, how do I break into this network or this system or this device, or how do I get there? I mean, that's a puzzle too. But I think the bigger puzzle is, how do we move forward? How do we actually do something different than we've been doing the last 20 years and make a change? That's a puzzle. I don't have the answer, but I love working at puzzles. And I think part of that too is, there's so many companies out there that need to be secure, and for all sorts of reasons, they're not going to be the place where we want them to be or need them to be. And we need to find answers in ways that we may not necessarily be comfortable with. And perfect security, total security, I think we all know that doesn't exist. But again, it goes back to that risk equation. Companies need to be secure as they need to be. What does that mean? And it's different for everybody. And they might get to that point in different ways. It requires understanding what their risk tolerance level is. It requires understanding, it's like MacGyver. Does anybody know who MacGyver is? Not know who MacGyver is. I've got some duct tape and some sticks and a 9-volt battery. How can I secure this server type of thing? You got to learn to deal with what's been given you. And I think at the end of the day, to me, what a secure environment is doing as much as you can from the vulnerability perspective, eliminating the known and the stuff that you should have already dealt with, so that you can focus on the unknown and be paranoid as crap and watch everything and monitor everything and never think that you're there. Security is not a point that you get to and it's a state, or it's a point of arrival. Security is a process. It's a lifestyle. It's something you do. It's never ending. Questions, comments, rebukes? I think I'm full of crap. Mm-hmm.
Really what they're asking for is vulnerability assessment. A lot of times you would say that if you go out of scope, is how do you avoid getting walked out or having people never do business with you again? You went out of scope or didn't do what they said.
So, I mean, there's no one right answer, but when I used to work with companies and they said we want a pen test, I would ask them to define it. And it can be a little bit tricky because you have to do what the customer wants when the customer's paying you. And if they want to call it a pen test, even though you knew it was a vulnerability assessment, we would do that. The going beyond the scope thing is a little bit tricky because, depending on what detecting technology is in place and how well they're working for the customer. You might have to be really careful, but the best thing that I've found in my experience is, you sort of need to have the bat phone. You need to have that contact available. When we were doing pen testing exercises, we would always have a point of contact that was on call. That if we saw something really bad and needed to tell them, you've got this gaping hole, you need to fix it immediately. Or we're seeing something, or we need permission. We're seeing something over here, but it's a little bit out of scope. Can you give us a little leeway? So, open lines of communication and back and forth is the best way. There's some things that can't be avoided. Again, when you're doing things manually, you're less likely to go out of bounds than, at least intentionally or unintentionally, than if you're using automated tools. Does that work for you? Other questions, comments? If I haven't totally turned you off, if you ever have any questions, I'm still kind of PCI focused. I do compliance in general, but really it's security best practices. But if you ever have any questions, I moderate a panel that's PCI's focused at Tenable. Actually, I need to update it. It's now discussions.tenable.com. That will still work. I'm on Twitter. Feel free to follow me. If you want to ask a question privately, that's fine too. And if there's nothing else, I highly recommend bacon. And a shout out to our friends at BLNT. And that's bacon ice cream there. Salted caramel bacon ice cream. I have had it several times this weekend. It's delicious. So that's, it doesn't come, the light doesn't work very well. That drink in the middle is called Beam and Bacon. It's bacon infused Jim Beam, ginger ale, and bacon strips. There's the Old McDonald's bacon and cheeseburger. They use duck bacon, regular pig bacon, and what was the third one? Lamb. Have you ever had lamb bacon? It's amazing. Parker, you can tell them about the one on the right there, the shooter. That's.
So it's Jameson, then pickle juice, which you're going with some people think isn't so good, but it is very good and it goes with it very well. It's a Bloody Mary shot. Then you got the bacon. I would recommend ordering extra bacon.
It's amazing how much bacon they put out. The mac and cheese, I mean, that plate it's got to be a 12-inch plate.
Where is that?
This is One North Meridian. You can follow them on Twitter. They're at BLT Indy. Go for it. All right, thanks a lot, guys.